There's a really excellent book that I think is probably one of the best on this that very few people know about or are aware of. And I was happy to have had a researcher recommend this to me on Twitter just randomly. And it's called The Milner-Fabian Conspiracy. It's actually like a 500-page text. It's really good. And it goes into basically the history of the Fabian Society, particularly obviously in the UK, but also how they did link up with and connect with and support all the other socialist movements. So even though they didn't really agree with everything that Lenin believed in, like Red Terror per se, or the bloody approach, they were big supporters. In fact, Sidney Webb, Beatrice Webb, they wrote letters to Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, and so forth, supporting the movement, even if they thought there might be better approaches. So what is the better approach? The idea is let's reform Marxism, and instead of this proletariat worker class, let's focus on recruiting wealthy people to fund the movement. And so they came up with the idea of reformed Marxism or capitalist-friendly Marxism. And this was seen as a much better approach, not just for optics, but for actually getting things done. They were also still consistent in their call for radical social Darwinism, the creation of a new man. All non-socialists eventually should perish. They believed in forms of dysgenics and genocide, and they just didn't want to be as open about it. And so I'm not saying the Fabian Society is a totally secret society. It's kind of a private public type of society, but it does share some of the elements of the strategies of planning things in secret. And here's the big key essential thing about the Fabian Society is doing things in slow motion rather than trying to do a fast, overt, bloody revolution. If we utilize the techniques and strategies of propaganda, psychological warfare, infiltrate and penetration and subversion is one of their phrases, we could get a lot more done than this overt model. So they very early on were very successful in recruiting very wealthy industrialists and capitalists, very, very powerful nobility as well. Lord Milner becomes one of their chief supporters. I would argue Lord Rothschild as well is in the background as a supporter. And this doesn't necessarily mean that everybody within these groups agrees on every single thing, but the Fabians do eventually become kind of a masked version of the Labor Party. So the Labor Party is really named after this whole idea. It used to be the Fabian ideology, but they renamed it as Labor to sound like they cared about the workers. But this is exactly why they have really this radical policy to which again, the Labor Party is really founded to establish and quote, implement Fabianism. And the other thing I want to mention that people overlook that was really ahead of its time that Rothschild talks about in his book was that they weren't so much interested in overt political terror like assassinations or revolution in the bloody sense, but they were very interested in culture war and aesthetic terrorism. In fact, they were some of the first to promote, I don't know if we're going to be on YouTube or not, so I don't know if I'm going to say this word, but bestiality in the public as a form of art. But they understood that what this would do is actually become a kind of aesthetic terrorism to brutalize and shock the public to move the social Overton window more and more and more towards the left. So they did believe in forms of aesthetic or artistic terrorism, maybe not as a much overt terror, even though they maintained the same bloody ideologies of the radical, Lenin Marxist types that believed that anyone not a part of the revolution would eventually have to die. George Bernard Shaw, another one of the famous Fabian socialists, was very overtly explicit in that most white people would especially have to die because they would not go along with this revolution. And the other thing to remember is that they were the key figures 100 plus years ago planning to open up the UK and by extension the rest of Europe to Islam as a strategy of social demographic change for socialism. According to Quigley in his other book, Anglo-American Establishment, the Kalergi Plan, which is a real thing, I have his book here. It's called Practical Idealism, in which he says that the existing stock of the European nations, including the UK, need to be destroyed and bred out.
Just insane. Just an insane.
Yeah, exactly. And people say, "Oh, it's a conspiracy theory." It's in his freaking book. Like, I've got the book. We've talked about it for years. But Quigley even says that, and Quigley's not a conspiracy theorist. For those that don't know, he was Bill Clinton's mentor. He is an apologist for this system. So he's not a conspiracy person. He's a promoter of it. On page 284, Quigley says that there were two plans that were adopted by the Royal Society in the 1930s, one of which was Lord Lionel Curtis's Commonwealth of God plan, accepted by the Roundtable Group. The other plan that they heard and accepted was the Kalergi plan. So the Fabian socialist plan that we are all living under is a combination of Curtis's Commonwealth of God, which is basically the Rhodes Ruskin style world socialist model, and the Kalergi plan of Count Coudenhove Kalergi to destroy the existing European people groups. And actually, some of the most powerful and influential people have been members openly. And the fact that this is something in the open doesn't mean that it can't also have an element of secrecy and subversion and long-term radical goals. So really those claims are just kind of red herrings and distractions from the known, very accessible history of the Fabian Society. For example, some of its members have included not just people that you've heard me mention, like Lord Alfred Milner, who was a huge supporter of this whole movement, as well as a lot of support from the Rothschilds, which Ratu talks about on pages 38 and 39. But this ideology included, of course, H.G. Wells. I've lectured through most of H.G. Wells's nonfiction books on my channel. Bertrand Russell, we've lectured through 2 or 3 of his books as well that deal with the erection of this sort of future technocratic socialist depopulation agenda, which, by the way, he was a big supporter also of the bringing in of Islam into the UK very, very early on. So a lot of the people who are, again, very prominent, well-known people were a part of this. And the long-term strategy, according to the people in it and the founders, is a radical strategy. It's just don't do the radicalism right away. So again, Bernard Shaw, all these people they talk about destroying the indigenous people groups of Europe and the UK, doing this through mass importation of foreign and specifically Islamic groups originally. And it's fascinating because early on in the text, the Ratu text, he points out how they didn't begin with Sunni Muslims. They began with Sufis at around 1910, 1920, bringing them to Cambridge and Oxford because, well, Sufis are a little more ecumenical and they're more, syncretist, and they're a little softer, and, they like other religions and systems like Neoplatonism, and they're mystical. But that actually set up the first pro-Islamic think tank organization in the UK that then began to bring other Islamic groups to where now we get Sadiq Khan and people who are Fabian socialist Islamic-ish. When these Fabian socialist institutions are set up in the UK, everything, as we said, from the London School of Economics to Chatham House, etc., and eventually the great British universities also end up kind of moving into being engines of this, whether it's Eton or Oxford or Cambridge. They're all really the same ideological structure here in terms of the power brokers. Maybe not every professor, but the overall power structure running things. So what happens is in the US, the elites in the US decide to kind of mirror this. It's called the Eastern Seaboard Establishment. The Rockefeller family at the forefront of this sets up in New York Pratt House, which is supposed to be the model for Chatham House. It's the New York version of Chatham House in the UK. Mm-hmm. And that spawns things like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and then eventually Bilderberg, all of which all share this same Fabian socialist ethos. again, even if not every individual espouses this, that's the overriding ideology. And one way to see that is to look at their chosen economist of choice. The elite chosen economist of all the Fabians, he's their premier, is John Maynard Keynes. Keynesian economics, which dominates the 20th century, which dominates academia throughout the world in the West, is a Fabian socialist exercise. So that explains the whole monetary principle, the whole support, the whole system. And you're absolutely right. The post-Bretton Woods system of the dollar as a world reserve currency, all of that mythology is beginning to collapse. And so that's actually a good thing, because that means a lot of the institutions and things built up as a result of it, whether it's the IMF or the World Bank or any of this kind of stuff, or the mainstream media, et cetera, that's legacy stuff is going to be collapsing. And Trajan Hope, which the Ratio book actually it relies significantly early on with Trajan Hope. Trajan Hope has a lot of also key insights into this network, this group. And as you get to about the middle of the book, if you ever find the time to read it, not you specifically, but anybody, because it's a massively dry technical read. There's 1,300 pages. But, he talks about this in the middle of the book as the Parabas Rothschild's banking system. And that's what's the locus and the heart of all of this. Even the Fabian Society couldn't really function without this massive support from these moneyed oligarchical elites and industrialists. Yeah, in fact, Ratio has a good chapter where he talks about how none of this could have actually been successful had there not been a faux conservative, faux right-wing controlled opposition that acted as if they were in a battle with these people, but would always concede. And we have the exact same thing, of course, in the U.S. We've had, the Republican Party, which for so many decades was really just the neoconservative Zionist Party, and it plays the role of conservative. And, that's by design, absolutely. And that itself is part of the Fabian dialectical control model, where you have false debates, false opposition, and usually people that are significant real opposition are filtered out. It's very difficult, to get into politics without money, whether it's in the U.S. or the U.K. So I think that a lot of this is done through, monetary control and backing. This ideology, even if the society itself isn't directly controlling everything or everybody, this ideology, again, John Maynard Keynes wasn't in the Fabian Society, but he's the chosen official economist of the Fabian Society. So, Bertrand Russell, I think, was only a member for a very short time, but it doesn't really matter, because all of the ideology that they promote is essentially compatible. Bill Clinton, third way proponent, just like Tony Blair, that's all the same thing as Fabian socialist ideology. So the dozens and dozens of, just in the U.S., leftist NGOs, think tanks, foundations that all network and coordinate together to help and to promote and to indoctrinate what are supposedly these organic leftist movements, demonstrations, revolutions, etc. And of course, there's countless of them. But what I was pointing out was simply that in the U.S. and the same in your country, we're not really going to see actual change until we realize that these politician grifters come and go, right? These boobs get voted in and voted out. But what doesn't change and doesn't go away is the dozens and hundreds of NGOs, think tanks, and foundations. And really, that's going to have to be uprooted before there's significant change, even above the politicians. A lot of the NGO leftist complex is a lot more integrated and a lot more coordinated than we tend to expect. And also, a lot of this is funded with our tax money. So, again, they're socialists, so they have no problem stealing and using the tax money against the population, because they're not actually populists, they're anti-populist. Yeah, so they're going to steal taxpayer money, utilize it for these operations, for these NGOs and whatnot. And I suspect they're much more coordinated. In fact, I think I was looking at some stats the other day, and it was something like there's in the world around 1 million NGOs, think tanks, and foundations that exist to, push, to lobby, to do whatever they do. And 90 to 95% of them are leftist. So all of that money is coming from these elites. They run the money printer. They run, the IRS, the, Federal Reserve. They run all that. They print the money, and they can just, I guess, infinitely fund this giant scam machine that they have. You actually can't get away from what we call the New Age movement, which post 1960s in the U.S. really encompasses everything from crystals to yoga to transcendental meditation to gurus, you name it. All of that stuff that comes out of the 1960s movement in the U.S. was actually predated and promulgated decades earlier by, you got it, Fabian socialist Madame Blavatsky, the founder of the religious synchronous cult called Theosophy. There's a great article by a history of espionage scholar, Dr. Richard Spence, about Theosophy's connection to intelligence operations as well. He argues, and it looks fairly substantially true, that Blavatsky was probably at some degree working as an intelligence operative. And so her secret teaching missions that she would do to these other countries were also probably going to meet with, for example, KGB operatives. So I'll send this article or I'll link it below, but that's because on a broader scale, there was tremendous support from the Rothschilds and from the other Fabians to push this free love message, not in the 1960s, but through Fabians in 1907. The Fabians were pushing open relationships, pan community, whatever you want to call that, in 1907. In fact, I mentioned that bestiality art that was intentionally a satanic construct. Let me see what he says about this. He says, behind the widely acknowledged talent of some of the Fabian artists, there actually lurked a dark secret for their deviant instincts. This all-pervading Fabian hold on society meant that the works of art like Gill produced, a Fabian practitioner of PDF, INCEST, and bestiality, would make their way into respectable institutions like the London Electric Railway, the BBC, the League of Nations, and even inside Westminster Cathedral. So notice, this isn't modern day New York MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, where they have degenerate, disgusting art. This is 1907.
That's insane.
So they were way ahead of the curve with satanic art, and explicitly satanic art 100 years before everybody else, paving the way, not just with all of the New Age occult type stuff with Blavatsky, Bailey, Besant, the three witches of the United Nations, right? All of whom, by the way, were Fabian socialists. They were also preparing the way for the, as we said, aesthetic attack on art. Other individuals associated include people like Gurdjieff, the self-help guru. And he says here, leading Fabians like Annie Besant, A.R. Orange, Clement Attlee also joined Masonic lodges with the idea of promoting Fabianism through Freemasonry. The alternative movements of these times, like Theosophy and even G.I. Gurdjieff's Fourth Way, became associated with and promoted Fabian socialism. And I want to say even remember the Scottish National Party some years back that was gaining attention to Brexit and all that kind of stuff. That they also, I believe, are a Fabian socialist institution. World Reconstruction Project.
Right.
Let me read just real briefly here what Ratu says about the wolf in sheep's clothing and this image. He says, as if to confirm the subversive nature of Fabians, George Bernard Shaw in 1910 commissioned a stained glass window from showing from left to right Fabian leaders Edward Pease, Sidney Webb, and Shaw himself, forging out of the world of the old, as the other Fabians kneel and worship, which is intended to be humorous, an attitude towards their writings elevated as if they were divine scripture and divine writ, and portraying a cult-like nature of socialism and the Fabian Society in particular, making socialism and Fabianism into a religious movement. And it says the Window's motto is remold the world nearer to the heart's desire, citing the medieval Iranian poet Omar Khayyam. And then there's this long Islamic thing. And then it says, Fabians would plan then to destroy and then reconstruct all of society according to their image. And thus the other image that they chose was a coat of arms of a wolf in sheep's clothing holding the red flags with FS, or Fabian Society, which is now still in existence, but located at the London School of Economics. So none of this has gone away. Here's the stained glass window with the three key founders in this sort of religious cult-like imagery. And
we'll
to your point,
on screen.
yeah, to your point, like this isn't just some random group of obscure, intellectuals and poet wannabes. This is institutional subversion and permeation that actually affected most of today's post-World War II Bretton Woods system. So when we talk about everything from the United Nations, well, the League of Nations and the United Nations, they were both founded with open Fabian socialist ideology. The World Council of Churches, the Aspen Institute, NATO, the IMF, the World Bank, on and on and on. They are all suffused with and literally headed up by open members of the Fabian Society committed to this ideology, all the way even to the early heads of the OSS, which is the predecessor to the CIA. They were headed up by Fabian socialists. The very beginning of British intelligence in terms of MI5, also Fabian socialism. So that's how influential this is, even to the point of U.S. presidents, Woodrow Wilson, under which we get the Federal Reserve. You got it, Fabian socialist.